Ner. There are moments in a man's life when everything he thought was permanent turns out to be nothing more than sand. I know that now. But for a long time, I didn't. My name is Daniel. I spent 17 years building something from nothing. A software company I co-founded out of a rented basement with 2 friends, a whiteboard full of ideas, and more coffee than was probably good for any of us. We called it Archbridge Technologies. By the time my marriage started falling apart, Archbridge had grown into a mid-sized firm with a solid reputation, a loyal client base, and about 60 employees who counted on us to show up and make good decisions every single day. My wife, Rachel, used to be proud of what I built. At least, I thought she was. She'd come to the early pitch meetings, sit in the back row, smile at me when I stumbled over my words. She had this way of squeezing my hand after a tough day that made me feel like the whole thing was worth it. I held on to that memory for a long time, even after the squeezing stopped. Somewhere along the way, the woman I married decided that what I'd built wasn't enough. Not the company, not the house, not the life. I was too quiet at dinner parties, she said. I didn't network enough. I wore the same gray jacket to too many events. I was, in her exact words, the most brilliant, boring man she had ever met, and she was tired of it. I didn't fight back when she said things like that. I probably should have. Instead, I went back to my desk and wrote cleaner code and told myself she was just stressed. That was my mistake, not the silence. The assumption that silence was the same as patience. The day I found out about her and Marcus was the same day our board voted to bring him in as CEO. Marcus Hale had the kind of easy confidence that rooms respond to before he's finished his first sentence. He wore his suits like they were designed specifically for his shoulders. He gave presentations that made investors lean forward in their chairs. He was everything Rachel had spent years telling me I wasn't, and I suppose it should have told me something earlier than it did. I found out about the 2 of them the way people usually find out, by accident, on a Tuesday when Rachel left her laptop open on the kitchen counter and a message thread loaded itself right in front of my eyes before I could look away. I didn't read the whole thing. I read enough. I closed the laptop and stood in my own kitchen for a long time, looking out the window at the backyard I'd landscaped myself one summer. And I thought very carefully about what kind of man I wanted to be from that point forward. I did not call a lawyer that night. I did not confront Rachel. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room where I'd been sleeping for 6 months already, and I opened my laptop and I looked at one specific document I hadn't reviewed in almost 4 years. The Archbridge Core Patent, filed in my name alone. It was a technical filing from the early days of the company when my co-founders and I divided up the foundational work and I had taken the architecture layer, the structural logic that every product we'd ever built ran on top of. We'd been in such a rush at the time that the formalities got handled quickly and quietly. My partners signed off on their respective sections. I filed mine. And then we all moved on and built a company, and nobody thought about the paperwork again. Nobody except me, apparently, because I had thought about it. Just not until that Tuesday night in the guest room. I closed my laptop after an hour. Then I called my patent attorney and left a message asking for a meeting at his earliest convenience. The board meeting where they announced Marcus as CEO happened the following week. I sat in the 3rd row and watched Rachel smile at him from across the room, and I understood everything I hadn't been willing to understand before. She hadn't just fallen for someone else. She had helped engineer this. Marcus hadn't found Archbridge on his own. He'd been introduced, guided in, positioned carefully, presented to the board as the answer to a question Rachel had spent months quietly whispering into the right ears. I clapped politely when the announcement was made. Marcus shook my hand afterward with the warmth of a man who assumes he has already won. 3 days later, I submitted my resignation. My co-founder Tyler, who was the closest thing I had to a brother in that office, caught me in the parking garage as I was loading the last box into my car. He looked at me like I'd just told him a relative had died. "You're really walking out," he said. "I'm walking out," I said. "Not because they pushed me, because I decided to." "There's a difference." "There will be," I said, and I meant it even though I couldn't explain it yet. I drove out of that parking garage on a Thursday afternoon in October with a box of personal items in my back seat and a plan that was still more instinct than detail. My attorney had confirmed what I already knew. The patent was airtight. Everything Archbridge built, everything they planned to build, every next-generation product Marcus had already begun presenting to investors ran on an architecture I had designed and filed and owned. They had been operating on a foundation that was, technically, mine, and nobody had thought to revisit that during the transition because nobody had thought I would ever leave. I didn't do anything with that information right away. I put it in a drawer the way you put something valuable in a safe place so it's there when you need it. Then I drove 4 hours north to a small town on the Maine coast called Harlow Bay, and I rented a cottage within walking distance of the water. My doctor had been telling me for 2 years to take a break. High blood pressure, chronic tension in my neck and shoulders, the kind of low-grade exhaustion that doesn't show up on tests but lives behind your eyes. He'd said it gently, and then he'd said it firmly, and then he'd said it with the particular tiredness of a man who knows his patient isn't listening. I had not been listening. I was listening now. Harlow Bay was exactly what it sounded like. A bay, a harbor, a main street with a diner and a hardware store and a place that sold kayak rentals and locally made candles in the same small building. The cottage I rented sat at the end of a gravel road with a view of the water that changed color depending on the time of day. I sat on the back porch that first morning and drank coffee and watched a seal surface 20 yards out and just float there, unbothered by everything, and I thought, I want to be that seal. I had been in Harlow Bay for 11 days when I walked into a bookshop on the main street looking for something to read that wasn't about technology or business or anything related to either. The woman behind the counter was trying to reach something on the top shelf with a step stool that was very clearly not going to hold her weight. I watched it wobble for half a second and then stepped forward and said, "Please don't do that," in what I intended as a helpful tone and probably came out as alarm. She startled, grabbed the shelf, and looked down at me with an expression that was equal parts annoyed and amused. "I've been getting things off that shelf for 3 years," she said. "On that particular stool?" She looked down at the stool. "New stool," she admitted. I got the book for her. She thanked me with the kind of brevity that suggested she was used to managing on her own and didn't want too much fuss made about having accepted help. Her name was Claire. She had short dark hair and reading glasses pushed up on top of her head that she kept forgetting were there and reaching for. She ran the shop alone, I learned over the next few visits, because her husband had passed away 2 years prior. A car accident on a highway in Vermont during a work trip. They'd had a daughter together, 4 years old at the time, named Poppy. I started coming back to the bookshop on a fairly regular basis, at first because I genuinely needed things to read, then because I had started to understand why I kept finding reasons to go. Claire was direct, without being harsh. She had strong opinions about fiction, mild opinions about most everything else, and a way of asking questions that made you feel like she was actually interested in your answer rather than just filling silence. She'd laugh at things that were quietly funny rather than things that were loudly trying to be. Poppy, who was now 6, would sometimes be in the shop after school, and she had decided early on that I was a worthy audience for her opinions about sea creatures, which were detailed and frequent and always welcome. I told Claire about Arch Bridge one afternoon when the shop was quiet and we were sitting with coffee in the 2 chairs she kept near the window. I told her about co-founding it, about the years of work, about stepping down. I didn't tell her about the patent yet. I didn't tell her about Rachel and Marcus. I told her the edited version, the version where I'd built something and left it and was figuring out what came next. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual and appreciated. "Do you miss it?" she asked when I finished. "I miss who I was when I started it," I said, "before I got used to not fighting back." She looked at me with the careful expression of someone who has understood more than was said and is deciding whether to say so. She didn't push. She just nodded and said, "Well, Poppy thinks you should stay in Harlow Bay permanently. She told me this morning that you're the only adult who knows that octopuses have 3 hearts." "They have blue blood too," I said. "I'll tell her. She'll be insufferable." I laughed. It surprised me a little, how easily it came. Tyler called me about 6 weeks after I'd arrived in Maine. He called on a Sunday evening, which meant it was either social or serious, and his voice told me immediately it was serious. "You need to know something," he said. "They're doing a full platform relaunch, new product suite. Marcus has been pitching it to investors for the last month. They're calling it Arch Bridge Elevate." I sat with that for a moment. What does Elevate run on? Same core architecture as everything else. Nobody's touched the foundation. They didn't think they needed to. Have they filed anything new? Not as far as I can tell. "Dan, I know what you're thinking. Do you?" "I think you should be careful." "I'm always careful," I said. "That's the problem everyone had with me." Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you planning?" "Nothing yet," I told him. "I'm still watching the seal." He had no idea what I meant by that, and I didn't explain. My attorney's name was Phil Garner, and he was one of those rare people who became more useful the calmer things appeared. I had called him twice since leaving Archbridge. He confirmed in both conversations, and with increasing certainty, that the patent situation was exactly what I thought it was. Archbridge Elevate, as described in the investor materials Tyler had quietly forwarded to me, was built directly on the patented architecture. Every product roadmap Marcus had presented, every feature, every integration, every headline number he'd shown to every investor meeting, depended on something he didn't own and hadn't thought to check. Phil told me we could proceed legally at any point of my choosing. He also told me that the cleanest and most complete resolution, the one that gave me the most control over the outcome, would be to request a private meeting before filing anything formally. One conversation. Marcus in a room. Me with the patent documents. If he's smart, Phil said, he'll negotiate. He's smart about the wrong things, I said. But we'll see. I thought about it for another week. I thought about the 60 people at Archbridge who had nothing to do with what Rachel and Marcus had done, who had just come to work and done their jobs and trusted that the company they worked for was standing on solid ground. I thought about the investors who had put money in based on presentations built around something that wasn't Marcus's to sell. I thought about Tyler, who had stayed. And I thought about what I actually wanted, not the revenge version, not the version where Marcus gets humiliated in a boardroom, but the version where things end up where they were supposed to be, where the work gets protected, where the people who deserve better actually get it. I called Phil and told him to set up the meeting. Rachel found out I was coming back to the city the way Rachel found out most things, through a network of people who told her things before she asked. One of those people was apparently someone in Marcus's office because she called me 2 days before the meeting was scheduled and her voice had that careful, managed quality I recognized as the sound of someone preparing to perform composure. "I heard you want to meet with Marcus," she said. "That's right. About the company." "That's right." A pause. "I think it would be a mistake." "I appreciate that, Daniel." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm sorry for how things ended. I want you to know that." I'd thought about what I'd say if this moment came. I'd run through different versions of it on the back porch in Harlow Bay, watching the water. I hadn't arrived at anything elegant. "I know you believe that," I said. "I hope you are. But it doesn't change what I need to do." "What do you need to do?" "I need to go into that meeting," I said. "That's all I'll say right now." She tried twice more to talk me out of it. I let her finish each time and then I said something brief and true and she eventually stopped trying. When she hung up, I sat in the cottage kitchen for a while in the quiet and I noticed that what I felt was not anger. I had expected anger. What I felt was something more like clarity, the specific lightness that comes when you stop carrying something you were never meant to carry. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 14th floor of the Archbridge building. I had Phil with me. Marcus had 2 people with him whose precise roles I never established. He greeted me at the door with his hand out and a smile that was doing a great deal of work, and I shook his hand and said it was good to see him and meant neither word. We sat down. Someone poured water. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the posture of a man hosting a meeting in his own house, which was, I supposed, what he believed he was doing. "Daniel," he said, "I'm glad you reached out. I've been hoping we could find a way forward that made sense for everyone." I let him finish. Then I opened the folder Phil had prepared, and I slid it across the table. "I want to give you the chance to read this before we talk," I said. He picked it up with the casual manner of a man who expects to be unimpressed. I watched his face while he read. It took about 90 seconds for the casual manner to become something else. His 2 associates leaned in, and I watched the information move from the documents to their eyes and down to somewhere in the back of each of their necks, where the cold feeling lives. When Marcus put the folder down, the smile was different, still present, but different. "This is the original filing," he said. "Yes." "From the founding period?" "Yes." He looked at Phil. Phil looked back at him with the pleasant expression of a man who has prepared very thoroughly and has absolutely nowhere else to be. "The new platform," Marcus said carefully, "runs on the same core architecture." "I know," I said. A long silence. One of his associates started to say something, and Marcus raised one hand slightly, and the associate stopped. "What is it that you want, Daniel?" he asked. I had thought about this answer too. I'd written it down and then thrown the paper away because I didn't need it anymore. I knew what I wanted. I'd known it since the night in the guest room. "I want Archbridge protected," I said. "I want the 63 people in this building to have jobs in 5 years. I want the investors who put their money in based on those presentations to actually get what they were shown. And I want the architecture that I designed, that the whole company is built on, to be treated with the seriousness it deserves." Marcus looked at me for a moment. "And in exchange, licensing agreement," Phil said. "Reasonable terms. Fair to both sides. We've drafted a proposed structure. It's in the folder." Marcus opened the folder again and turned to the second document. He read it more slowly this time. When he finished, he looked up at me, and there was something different in his expression now. Something that wasn't quite respect, but was its neighbor. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "I've been thinking about it," I said. "Planning takes a few weeks. Thinking takes longer." He looked back at the document. His two associates exchanged a glance. One of them whispered something I didn't catch. Marcus nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting weather. "I'll need my lawyers to review this," he said. "Of course," Phil said. "We'd expect nothing less. We've allowed 30 days for a response." Marcus closed the folder. He looked at me again. I held his gaze without leaning forward, without crossing my arms, without any of the physical vocabulary of aggression. I had nothing to prove in that room. I had already proved everything I needed to prove before I walked in. "You could have filed without the meeting," he said. "You could have made this a lot messier." "I could have," I said. "I chose not to." "Why?" I thought about Claire, sitting in the chair by the window at the bookshop, asking me if I missed it. I thought about Poppy and the 3 hearts of the octopus. I thought about the seal, floating on the water without urgency, unbothered by everything. "Because I've learned," I said, "that the cleanest wins are the ones where you don't have to break anything to get there." We shook hands again at the door. His hand was slightly less assured than it had been 40 minutes earlier. Mine was the same. The licensing agreement was signed 26 days later. Phil called me from his office and read me the key terms, and I listened from the back porch of the cottage with my coffee getting cold in my hand. The terms were fair. Better than fair in a few places. Archbridge got to keep building. The employees kept their jobs. The investors got the company they'd been promised. And every product that ran on the architecture I designed would, from that point forward, do so with a contract that said clearly and permanently whose design it was. I didn't celebrate that night. I made dinner and walked down to the water and stood there for a while, and it occurred to me that I didn't feel the way I'd expected revenge to feel. Because it wasn't revenge exactly. It was more like reclaiming something I'd been careless with. My own work. My own name. The thing I'd made that was worth making. Tyler called 2 days later. "I heard," he said. "Word travels," I said. "Are you coming back?" "No," I said. "But I'm not going anywhere either. I'm right here." He laughed at that. Then he said, "Rachel knows." I assumed she would. "She's not taking it well." "That's between her and herself," I said. "I hope she figures it out. I mean that." He was quiet for a moment. "You know, when you drove out of that parking garage, I thought you'd lost it. I thought the whole thing had broken you." "It almost did," I said. "Then I found a good bookshop." "A bookshop. In Harlow Bay. You should visit sometime." He said maybe he would, and I believed him, and we hung up. That evening, Claire and I took Poppy to the harbor to watch the boats come in. Poppy had recently become interested in the specific hierarchy of nautical knots and was explaining this to me with great seriousness while Claire walked beside us with her coffee and her reading glasses still pushed up on top of her head, forgetting again that they were there. The light was the color it gets in Maine in late November, low and amber and long, and it sat on the water in a way that made everything look like it had been painted carefully by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Poppy tugged my sleeve and said, "Do you know a bowline knot?" "I know what one is," I said. "I don't know how to tie one." "I'll teach you," she said with the absolute authority of a 6-year-old sharing expertise. "Deal," I said. Claire looked over at me with a small smile. She had a way of not saying the thing she was thinking and letting it sit warmly in the air between you instead. And I had come to understand that this was one of the things I valued most about her. The economy of it. The trust that things didn't always need to be named to be real. I didn't have a grand plan for what came next. I had some ideas about consulting, about applying the architectural work more broadly, about building something new and smaller and more deliberately mine. I had Phil on retainer and Tyler's phone number and a cottage lease that still had 4 months left on it. I had a bookshop I knew my way around and a 6-year-old nautical expert and a woman who asked the right questions and let the answers land without rushing them. And I had this, the specific piece of a man who did the hard thing the right way and doesn't need anyone else to know how hard it was. That's the piece that holds. The other kind, the loud kind, The kind built on watching someone else fall. That kind needs maintenance. This kind just sits there quietly and stays. Some months later, I was in the bookshop on a weekday afternoon when Claire came in from the back with a box of new arrivals and asked, without looking up from the box, whether I'd given any thought to what I wanted to do with the patent licensing income. Some, I said, and I thought I might open something, in town, something small. She set the box down and looked at me over the top of the reading glasses she had actually remembered to put on this time. What kind of something? I haven't decided, I said, but I think it should involve the harbor, and probably Poppy's input at some point. She considered this. She'll have opinions. That's what I'm counting on, I said. She smiled then. The real one, the one without any management in it, and she picked up the box again and carried it back toward the shelves. And I followed because there were books to unpack and afternoon light still coming through the window and nowhere in the world I needed to be except exactly there.